One of the most common PC building mistakes I see on a regular basis is that everything will be plugged in perfectly fine and connected right, but when they go to plug everything in on the back of the computer, and then go to turn it on, the customer's computer will often fire up with all the fans and lights running, but they'll end up with either no display out, or terrible performance to the point where they regret their purchase. All when nothing's actually wrong with the system. At least internally, because the only thing wrong here is where our HDMI cable's plugged in. Because even though our HDMI cable does fit, and in our circumstance does work, if you have a GPU, you never want to be plugging in your display cables to any of these vertical ports here on your motherboard I/O, because any display out on your motherboard I/O is going to be handled by something called your iGPU, otherwise known as the integrated graphics processor that's built on board to your CPU, which you can think of like a cut down mini GPU that's built onto your CPU. And you don't want to be using that because the integrated graphics built onto your CPU aren't what you paid for when you bought your nice dedicated graphics card. Because by plugging in here, you're not taking advantage of that GPU's performance. But that's not the only problem. Well, you remember how I said people get no display when plugging into the HDMI on their motherboard I/O? Well, that's because not every CPU has a dedicated iGPU. As both AMD and Intel have F-series CPUs, that's the suffix at the end of the name here, well, that indicates that these CPUs don't have an integrated graphics processor, which means even though your motherboard may have a dedicated output on its motherboard I/O, it's not guaranteed to work, which is one of the most common reasons why people will end up with no display out when they plug in their HDMI or DisplayPort cable to their motherboard I/O, because it's got a CPU that doesn't have a GPU in it. But those display and performance issues can both be avoided by taking your HDMI or DisplayPort cable and instead of plugging into your motherboard I/O ports, those are typically the vertical ports, plug into the horizontal ports that are actually coming off of your GPU, as this way not only will you get display, but you'll actually be taking advantage of your nice GPU. And then one of my favorite pro tips that you can not only do for yourself, but can be super helpful if you're building a system for somebody else, so you can avoid even troubleshooting this, locate the little plastic covers on your GPU, pull those out, and then plug them into any HDMI or DisplayPort on your motherboard I/O. This way you or your friend can't mess it up. So just remember, if you have a dedicated GPU, you always want to take advantage of it by plugging into the GPU I/O for your display outs. These are typically horizontal and not the vertical ports off your motherboard I/O.